So for the first step, I've sketched an outline for the painting using an HB pencil onto cold press watercolour paper. For the second step, I'm going to paint the sky. I'm mixing up some Cerulean here using a size 8 brush, adding lots of water. It's quite a big sky, so always mix up more paint than you think you need so you don't run out halfway through. I'm mixing up here Cobalt blue mixed with the Cerulean, about 50-50. And I'm also going to mix up Cobalt blue on its own. You can use Ultramarine as an alternative. And I'm mixing a pinch of Pyrrole Red into the Cerulean and Cobalt blue mix, just to sort of grey it down a little bit and make it look more natural. I'm wetting the sky with a large brush. Take your time doing this to really allow the water to sink through that paper, because it will give you longer time to work so it doesn't dry out too quickly. And I'm painting right down to the sort of top of the mountains. Loading my brush with a little bit of that Cerulean there, and I'm painting wet into wet, tilting to allow the paint to flow. A little bit of Cobalt blue here on the sort of top left, leaving gaps for clouds and tilting. So I'm getting a real mixture of blues here. And I'm actually spritzing with a spritzer bottle because, believe it or not, my painting is drying out too quickly. So don't hesitate to use your spritzer bottle, and I'm just tilting the sky. Loading the brush with more of the Cobalt blue. I'm making it slightly creamier here, so adding a little bit more paint, less water. And I'm going to paint this at the top of the sky. That's the nearest part to us because it's in the foreground. And as the sky goes off into the distance, the tonal values will get paler. So I'm tilting, and again I've left gaps for the clouds. And just tilt, take your time, tilting in different directions. Just loading my brush now, painting with the Cerulean, the Cobalt blue with a pinch of red mix there. A little bit more of a grey colour. Painting this wet into wet, again leaving gaps for clouds. And I'm painting right up to the top of the mountain here. And again I'm tilting to allow the paint to flow so the sky looks more natural. Remember to keep loading your brush with paint as well. As you go towards the mountains, you want the gaps of the clouds to get smaller so they kind of look a little bit further away. So just adding a little bit more of that grey there to the left hand side, wet into wet, to add a little bit more interest to those clouds. I didn't want to have it too dark on this side because I've got those two trees on the left that I want to paint later in the tutorial. So if it's too dark, it's going to be quite tricky to be able to see them. So make it a little bit lighter. So just adding a little bit more paint now to the sky at the top of the mountain there, and again tilting. And just make sure you collect your puddles as well. You don't want them to run back into the painting because they could cause cauliflowers when you have wet paint running into drying paint. For step 3, I'm going to paint some shadows onto the mountains using my size 6 round brush. I've mixed up Cobalt blue with Pyrrole Red, about 70-30 with lots of water. And I'm just sort of starting off with some shadowy marks here, wet on dry. Remember, less is more in watercolour. You want to leave lots of the white of the paper as well. And you can't paint every single mark, etc. You're just giving an impression. So try to keep the marks looking different, sort of small marks, sort of like triangle marks, and just look thin lines, etc. It's fun to do, and it's amazing how it does create the illusion of this sort of snowy mountainside. You've got some large kind of shadowy areas here, so I'm still using the same colour, the Cobalt blue mixed with a pinch of the Pyrrole Red, and I've diluted it a little bit more, and I'm just painting these sort of large shadowy areas using my size 6 brush, loading the brush here. And as I go to the right hand side, I keep it even more simple because it's sort of going off and out of the picture. I don't want to draw attention to it too much. So just painting a little bit of wet in wet here, just to paint that large sort of shadow there. I don't want to draw too much attention to the mountainside because it is the background. So these cool colours work, and keeping the sort of colours pale as well, not too dark so they come forward. Paler tonal values recede and it creates the depth in the painting. Remember to leave lots of white as well. I'm using the paper towel as well to lift off some of the paint to create some lights here and there and sort of texture as well. I'm going to allow the painting to dry once more. For step 4, I'm going to start painting the buildings and some of the trees and bushes. So I've started off with some Pyrrole Red here and a pinch of the Cobalt blue, and I'm painting the rooftop wet on dry with my size 4 round brush. I'm really taking my time here, as the house to me is the focal point. It's where your eye goes first of all in the painting, with that red rooftop and the white sort of front of the building with that cast shadow, which I think will work really well. So I'm just taking my time, using my size 4 brush and just painting in the detail, using a bit of burnt sienna and red here, and just carefully painting the right hand side of the rooftop there. And I'm just going to paint the red, sort of almost orangey red rooftop here to the right hand side with this smaller outbuilding, using the Pyrrole Red with a pinch of yellow. Again, working wet on dry. Always use a brush that you feel comfortable with, but also kind of holds lots of paint, even if it's a small brush like this. So I'm just adding the warm colours and details here and there, top of the windows, using a little bit of burnt sienna here to paint the window frames wet on dry. Again, use a brush that you feel comfortable with, even if you have to go smaller as well for these kind of smaller details. You don't have to paint every little bit of detail in. You're just, again, giving an impression, a bit like with the sort of mountains in the distance there. So just adding the details, wet on dry, the smaller windows here, sort of even less information, just using the tip of the brush. But remember to keep loading the brush as well with paint so the colours look vibrant. So just adding a bit of detail here to the left hand side of the building, rinsing my brush and then just softening and diluting there with a clean wet brush. Painting this small outbuilding here to the left of the house, wet on dry, with a very dilute burnt sienna with a pinch of the Cobalt blue. So it's a little bit more neutral, so it doesn't come forward as much. I'm using that colour on the front of that outbuilding there on the right. Mixing up some of the Cobalt blue with a pinch of the red, lots of water. I'm just painting some of the sort of snowy area here on the right hand side, wet on dry with my size 4 round brush, just rinsing my brush and just diluting some of that colour to push it back a little bit there. Rinsing my brush and just getting a clean wet brush to work from the outside in, just to really soften and pale that area. And I'm mixing up here buff titanium with a little bit of raw sienna. I'm actually using a calligraphy brush here. I've had it for years and I thought it'd be fun to use. I'm just sort of scrubbing on, wet on dry, that pale colour, and then adding a little bit of sap green to it there to create the bushes here on the right hand side. Adding a little bit of blue to that sort of light green colour and just painting a slightly sort of mid green here. The reason why I'm using this brush is so I can sort of scrub on and create some textured marks. Now, if you don't have a brush like this, don't worry. You could just use an old round brush and just sort of scrub on to create some textures. And I'm just adding some marks there just at the bottom there as it goes into the snowy area. Wet on dry, and then adding some of the little bushes in front of the buildings there, wet on dry. Mixing up a little bit of quinacridone gold here with the cerulean. And I am painting some of the trees now behind the buildings. Now, you may want to allow your painting to dry. Mine has pretty much dried, and I'm using that calligraphy brush, which I believe is goat hair as well. And I'm just sort of painting these trees wet on dry, creating some texture here as well, taking off the excess paint off on the paper towel so my brush isn't totally wet, so you get a nice textured dry brush effect. Adding a little bit of more raw sienna here, and you could even add a little bit of sap green if you wanted to, or just mix one of the blues, and just varying the greens, keeping the colours sort of light to a mid-tone value here. Now I'm mixing up a darker green, and I have used a little bit of phthalo blue with burnt sienna, and I am painting using my size Foreground brush, and just sort of painting the darks just above the buildings here, so you've got a dark against light in a way, so it really brings the buildings forwards. And I'm just sort of blending some of that dark into the trees there as well, damp into damp, and just sort of finessing here and cutting into the little building there. And again, using that calligraphy brush, using some of the raw sienna, you can use yellow ochre, wet on dry. And this brush is about a size 8 round brush size, so you could use that as an alternative. And just adding some darks here, using the burnt sienna with the phthalo blue, and painting damp into damp some of the fir trees behind the star of the show. And I'm sort of using horizontal marks, damp into damp, to create the sort of branches of those distinctive trees there. Sort of swishing my brush side to side, keep it simple, don't go back and forth painting over and over. Try to paint once and move on. So just swapping now to a small round brush just to finesse and paint the dark around the top of the rooftop there. And just blending it into the trees. And just painting the tops of the trees there using the tip of the brush. Adding a little bit more detail here. There's a bit of an awkward gap, so I'm just filling in there. And I'm going to swap back to the calligraphy brush, adding the sort of raw sienna mixed with a little bit of the sap green or a touch of blue, painting that light wash, that light sort of natural green colour there, wet on dry, creating sort of textures there, and just working my way along using that sort of light colour, and just painting those wavy marks there to create the look of those branches there as well, and using the tip of the brush as I go up the tree to paint smaller marks as the tree gets narrow as it goes to the top of the tree there. And I've swapped again to a smaller brush to get that detail. Again, I'm painting damp into damp, the darker green, wavy marks, horizontal marks there, using the phthalo blue mixed with the burnt sienna, and just adding the darks in on top of that light colour, damp into damp, leaving some of the light colour coming through as well. So again, sort of painting these taller trees now as we go on to the left, using that brush, sort of smaller marks at the top of the tree, creating texture, using the raw sienna, and you can use a pinch of green or even a pinch of blue, and just working, painting those sort of horizontal wavy sort of marks there to create the look of those branches. You don't have to fill in all the white gaps as well, you can leave those coming through. Mixing up a bit of a mid-green here, painting damp into damp, so I'm varying the colours so you can add just a little bit more blue to that raw sienna, and I'm just sort of working my way towards the left there, building up the details. Going back to a smaller brush here, and I'm painting damp into damp, some dark green just behind this little outbuilding here to bring that forward and push the trees back. So just outlining it, but then you want to sort of blend that dark damp into that lighter green there, and just sort of painting some more dark greens just on that horizon line there as well. And you can use the phthalo blue and the burnt sienna, working damp into damp. For step 5, I'm going to continue on painting these larger trees to the left. I'm also going to paint some darks and details on the buildings. And I'm going to paint more details in the mountains. So continuing on here, using that sort of light colour there, working wet on dry, creating the texture. So I'm letting my brush dance towards the left-hand side of the paper here, creating lots of sort of swervy horizontal marks there. I want to keep this area quite pale because I'm going to be painting the foreground trees on top of this area. So just adding a little bit of dark here to the left hand side, using the tip of my brush, adding some details to the top of the trees. I actually use sap green with a little bit of Paynes grey, and I'm just using a little bit of that colour, painting damp into damp on the right hand side here, just almost abstract marks using my size 6 round brush. Again, you can vary your greens, add a little bit more yellow, maybe a little bit more raw sienna, and just sort of play around and experiment, creating these lovely sort of almost wet on dry areas. I'm sort of scrubbing my brush, use a little bit of raw sienna there on the right hand side as well. A few more darks here just at the bottom of the grasses and in front of the buildings there, using the size 6 brush, working pretty much wet on dry now. Adding some darks to the bushes there in front of the house, and just using the tip of my brush just to add a few more darks and details on the horizon there. And I am using my size 4 round brush just to paint a little bit of shadow to the left hand side of the windows, using a dilute cobalt blue with a pinch of Pyrrole Red. Using that same colour to paint the wire going across the building there, and adding a few more little darks and details in front of the building and towards the left hand side. Adding a bit of shadow here just underneath the eaves, using my size 4 brush, the cobalt blue and the Pyrrole Red, painting a little doorway here, touch of artistic license, and a little bit of detail and textures, wet on dry. Finish off this stage by painting a cast shadow across the rooftop there on the left. So I've mixed up some of the cobalt blue with the Pyrrole Red, and I am painting, using my size 6 brush, some darks and details on the mountains. Now you don't want them too dark, but you just want to create a little bit more detail to bring these mountains to life. So just working my way around here, just darkening out some of the areas. And you don't want to go too dark because the mountain will come forward. So you just want to add these little dark accents here and there. Just adding a few little trees here on that sort of snowy field there. Just a few little sort of distant trees, using a little bit of the cobalt blue with a pinch of the raw sienna. And then just using a clean damp brush just to soften that, to push it back a little bit there. And just painting a little bit of detail on the snowy field there, using my size 2 round brush, using some Paynes grey with a pinch of yellow. So I am using the cobalt blue with a pinch of the Pyrrole Red, painting wet on dry with my size 6 round brush, the cast shadow on the building, and it really brings it to life. And you can add a little bit more shadow to the left hand side of the windows, wet on dry. And again, using that shadow colour to add some shadows around the building, the sort of rooftops there, and just sort of really bringing everything to life, adding some shadow to the little outbuilding here across the left hand side, and adding a little door as well, using my size 4 round brush. I'm going to allow my painting to dry. For this final step, step 6, I am going to add the trees, the 2 main trees to the left hand side. I'm going to add some more darks and details here and there, and of course the shadows of the trees to finish. So I'm starting off with the trees on the left here, mixing up some yellow raw sienna with a little bit of phthalo blue. And I am using a kind of textured foliage brush here, but you could use a hog hair brush. And I'm sort of stippling the sort of branches on here, wet on dry. As you can see, just tapping the painting there, using this sort of light earthy green colour as I work my way up. So you can't really see the tree at the moment, don't worry. It's a sort of process. I'm just getting the shape of the sort of tree on the left, and then just adding a little bit more of this earthy green as I go up into the sky area there, and it gets narrower. It's almost like a triangle shape. And I'm sort of painting the branches both left and sort of right of the tree trunk as well. So if you don't have a sort of foliage brush or a hoghair brush, you can use the belly of your sort of round paint brushes to sort of scrub on the paint. So I'm using a mid-green, so I've added sap green and I'm sort of using the belly of the brush and also the tip of the brush to stipple on the sort of branches and foliage here, left and right of the tree trunk there, just to build up that tree. So this is the mid-tone. I started with a light tone, now this is the mid-tone. I'm going to do the same for the tree to the right. I'm only going to paint 2 trees. There are 3, but I've decided to stick to 2, otherwise it looked too busy to me. So I've turned my painting sideways just to paint the tree trunk. So I've started off with raw sienna mixed with a bit of buff titanium, so it's sort of light. And I am now painting the dark side of the tree, the right hand side of the tree, using burnt sienna and Paynes grey, working damp into damp using my size 4 round brush. I find it easier to paint sort of long tree trunks or branches by actually turning the paper sideways. It just keeps my hand steady. And I'm just painting the bottom of the tree trunk here, sort of fanning it out so it looks like it's growing out of the ground. I've actually added a little bit of raw sienna there at the bottom as well. And I'm just blending with a clean damp brush. And I'm using a clean damp brush to lift off some of the paint to create lighter foliage and also the branches that also appear to be coming towards us as well. I'm just painting some smaller tree trunks here for these trees going off in the distance, wet on dry, using burnt sienna and Paynes grey. And I'm just adding a little bit of foliage there, wet on dry, using sap green mixed with Paynes grey. You could use cobalt blue mixed with yellow, and it's just to use the belly of the brush to create the texture, to bring those trees forward away from the distant trees. I have mixed up the cobalt blue with a pinch of the Pyrrole Red, a nice big puddle, and I'm painting the shadow colour wet on dry with my size 8 round brush. You can see the shadow in the photograph, so don't be afraid to paint it. You don't have to have a smooth sort of straight line. You can use a little bit of dry brush as well to create sparkle and ragged edges. Just painting a little bit more shadow in the foreground here, and I'm also going to paint some shadows from the trees in the distance there, just to really kind of bring them to life as well. A little bit on the horizon and in front of the building as well, just to kind of really sort of smooth things out in the foreground. I've added a pinch of Paynes grey to that cobalt blue and Pyrrole Red, and I'm painting damp into damp some dark directly beneath the tree to create a darker shadow. And I'm just adding a little bit more dark to the right hand side of the tree trunks here to finish off my painting. And here is the finished painting. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial and found it helpful, painting mountains and trees, etc. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section. And if you'd like to learn more about watercolour painting, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? You'll get access to the drawing template of this tutorial, plus a downloadable PDF with step-by-step photographs of each step of the painting with detailed instructions, and the tutorial will be extended. You'll also get access to my weekly exclusive tutorials. More details about the membership can be found in the description below. Just click Patreon. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. Happy painting. Bye for now.